You awaken bound by incense smoke and chanting. The flicker of oil lamps reveals figures masked in gold leaf, their movements slow, rehearsed, and terrifyingly calm. The air hums with rhythm drums pounding like a second heartbeat that isn't yours. Beneath you, the ground is warm, pulsing as if the stone itself breathes. The smell of burned resin clings to your throat, the copper tang of blood seeps into the incense. The idols around you glimmer with eyes carved too deep, their mouths open as if waiting to devour sound itself. You try to scream, but the chant swells, swallowing your voice. You're not a prisoner of war. You're an offering, a chosen vessel whose fear is part of the ritual. As the priest's blade rises, you realize death isn't the end. It's a doorway they mean to keep open. Your flesh is only a passage, your soul a tool. And as the chanting crescendos, the torches flare against murals of kings and gods, the empires that sang of light while perfecting darkness in their temples. Civilizations of splendor, whose greatest horrors were not lost to time but hidden buried in the rituals too disturbing for even the boldest storytellers to recreate. If you can stomach what history hid, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because this journey into humanity's forgotten rituals will test what you believe about civilization itself. Across continents and centuries, from the Nile to the Andes, from the marble courts of empires to jungle altars lost to time, these were not acts of chaos or madness. They were state-sanctioned systems, rituals performed with precision, paperwork, and pride. The blood spilled was tallied in temple ledgers, the screams recorded as offerings in papyrus decrees. Archaeologists still unearth their traces, scorched altars, ceremonial pits lined with bones, and carvings depicting rites once considered holy. Chroniclers wrote of them with awe, not disgust. They believed cruelty could please the gods. Tonight, we open those archives, the fragments of a world where faith, power, and fear fused into machines of devotion. What you're about to hear are 5 rituals too disturbing for movies. The first ritual begins where sunlight itself seemed to hesitate, atop the great Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan. The empire of the Aztecs, glittering in obsidian and gold, called it the Harvest of Hearts. To them, it was renewal. To the captives, it was a factory of death disguised as worship. Every detail was systematic. Victims didn't arrive as nameless captives. They were sorted, catalogued, evaluated. Spanish chroniclers like Bernal Diaz described lines of men and women awaiting sacrifice, guarded by priests with obsidian knives so sharp they could cut a hair in air. Ledgers unearthed beneath the temple complex list the offerings like inventory: 30 males, 20 youths, 15 maidens, healthy, unblemished. Each entry stamped with the glyph of a god, as if signed by the divine itself. At dawn, drums signaled the start of the ritual. The victims were painted with sacred blue pigment, symbolizing life, the irony thick as incense. One by one, they were marched up the pyramid steps. Some tried to walk proudly, believing their deaths would keep the sun alive. Others wept, collapsing under the chants that drowned their fear. When the knife fell, the priests moved fast. The body wasn't left to lie. It was rolled down the stone slope to the plaza, where attendants waited to dismember it for ritual feasts. Psychological warfare, refined over generations, ensured entire cities surrendered just to avoid supplying more hearts to the gods. Archaeologists uncovered channels carved into the altar's edge, grooves engineered to drain blood efficiently into stone cisterns below. Efficiency, the same word the empire's records used when describing harvests or taxation. The industrial-scale dehumanization wasn't hidden, it was holy. Children grew up watching these rites, learning early that fear was sacred and that their empire's balance depended on precise butchery. Even the victims' screams became part of the choreography transcribed by temple scribes into poetry. But while the Aztec Empire fell beneath Spanish steel, its logic survived elsewhere. Power always finds a way to sanctify control. And in the ports of Carthage, centuries earlier, another kind of offering was taking shape. Smaller in scale, infinitely crueler in intimacy. The second ritual was called the Promise of Moloch, and its victims were children. The city's wealth was legendary, its ships the envy of the Mediterranean. But prosperity, they believed, came at a price only innocence could pay. Beneath the city's outer walls lay the Tophet, a field of urns, thousands of them, each holding the burned bones of infants. For centuries, scholars argued, were these the results of disease or deliberate sacrifice? Yet inscriptions read like accounting, vow fulfilled, favor granted. Archaeologists found altars blackened not by time, but by repeated flame. Carthaginian parents weren't monsters. They were products of psychological warfare waged by faith itself. The ritual began with choice cloaked as duty. When famine struck, or battle loomed, the city's elite gathered before the bronze idol of Baal Hammon, its outstretched hands hollow and heated by fire. Priests sang hymns to drown the cries as infants were laid upon the scorching metal, sliding into the flames below. Chroniclers wrote of drums beating to mask the sound, but others said the noise was meant to rise, a melody of devotion that reached the heavens. The system rewarded loyalty. Families that offered their firstborn were promised divine favor, tax relief, or political advancement. It was an institutionalized cruelty, not mob hysteria. Ancient records from rival cities mention official ceremonies overseen by magistrates, their signatures beside the priestly seals. The act was euphemistically called returning the gift of life. And it was contagious. In nearby Sparta, an empire that worshipped discipline above compassion, newborns were examined for strength. Those deemed weak were left at Mount Taygetus, a ritualized exposure disguised as civic hygiene. Spartan mothers were trained not to weep. Soldiers said their city was purified by the silence of unwanted cries. Again, faith and law intertwined until empathy became treason. The systematic logic was simple. A body unfit for war was a threat to the state, and eliminating it was seen not as murder but maintenance. Each civilization polished its horror with reason. And sometimes cruelty was performed not in fire or sunlight, but beneath the earth, in darkness masquerading as devotion. The third ritual began in silence. Deep beneath Chinese and Scythian tombs, archaeologists uncovered what chroniclers called the ghost marriages ceremonies, uniting the living with the dead. When a nobleman died unmarried, his family sought a bride to accompany him into eternity. The practice began as symbolism. Over centuries, it evolved into systematic ritualized death. Historical texts from the Zhou and Han dynasties reference companions of burial, chosen from servants or concubines. Once selected, the woman was dressed in bridal red, her wrists bound with silk, her name recorded beside her lord's. She would drink wine laced with opium, or sometimes nothing at all, before being sealed alive inside the tomb chamber. Excavations in modern-day Xi'an have revealed skeletons found clasping one another, the noble untouched, the attendant contorted, her fingernails clawing at stone. The euphemism in imperial records is chilling, to ensure harmony in the afterlife. Harmony, in this sense, meant possession. The dead man's lineage continued unbroken. The woman's identity ended as property of the tomb. Chroniclers never condemned it. They praised it as devotion beyond death. Among the nomadic Scythians, the scale was even more macabre. When a chieftain died, his servants and horses were strangled and buried around his body in concentric circles. Herodotus recorded that 50 attendants would join their master willingly, or so the priests claimed. Yet in graves unearthed across the Eurasian steppe, archaeologists found wrists tied behind backs, skulls fractured, and jewelry still clutched in desperate fists. The industrial dehumanization of death had reached perfection, each layer of burial a ring of servitude encircling silence. The horror lay not in the violence, but in the normalization. These were not crimes. They were ceremonies, rehearsed and revered. The participants believed compliance guaranteed salvation. Refusal meant spiritual exile. It was a psychological warfare more potent than swords, obedience carried into eternity. In all these empires, bureaucracy shadowed belief. Scribes recorded, priests approved, architects designed the spaces of death with geometric precision. Every cruelty wore the mask of order. If this chills you as it does me, subscribe and stay with me, because the next rituals defied not just morality, but the limits of the human mind itself. What came next blurred the line between worship and madness, turning living bodies into instruments of prophecy. The next descent into ritual madness begins not in a dungeon or temple of blood, but in the sanctuaries of gods that promised enlightenment. In Mesopotamia, the beating heart of civilization, Temples rose like stairways to heaven. Yet within their courtyards, beneath the perfume of incense and the glow of oil lamps, lived the living oracles, men and women consumed by the machinery of belief. These were not prophets by choice, they were chosen. Clay tablets from Babylon and Ashur describe the process in clinical detail. Children of certain families offered to temples for the service of the gods. Their identities erased upon entry, replaced by ceremonial titles: the mouth, the vessel, the bride of the wind. They were confined in sacred chambers, starved, drugged, and isolated to induce visions. Priests watched through grates, recording every word as divine revelation. To the outside world, their words guided kings. To those within, it was an existence of systematic psychological warfare. Food withheld until prophecy came. Silence enforced until madness bloomed. Archaeologists unearthed rooms lined with copper fittings, once used to secure restraints. Clay bowls still bore residues of psychoactive resins. Inscriptions on surviving ledgers even calculate the success rate of prophecies. From 20 vessels, 7 gave speech by the third moon. Acceptable yield. Imagine that, divinity measured in percentages. The temple was a laboratory of devotion, and its victims were data points. Even the language of devotion was euphemistic. Scribes described the trances as illumination, though eyewitness accounts from visiting traders called it the shaking sickness. These oracles, once human, became trembling instruments whose pain was interpreted as holy wisdom. In Egypt, the practice took another form. There, the ritual of possession was performed to allow gods to speak through a living medium. But the ceremony demanded purity, and purity meant mutilation. Eunuchs served as intermediaries, their bodies reshaped by decree. Papyrus decrees detail their maintenance, like sacred livestock: diet, cleanliness, ritual fasting schedules. Every act of control sanctified by religion, every humiliation disguised as honor. The systematic cruelty was breathtaking in its sophistication. Power learned to enslave the soul by convincing it that obedience was sacred. The living oracles weren't prisoners, they were instruments of a faith that devoured its own. But the final ritual, perhaps the most haunting of them all, unfolded not in secret, but before crowds who cheered as flames rose. Across ancient India and the medieval courts of Europe, there existed what priests called the trial of purity. It was justice wrapped in fire. In Vedic ritual texts, the ordeal was known as Agni Pariksha, the test by flame. A woman accused of impurity, betrayal, or blasphemy would be made to prove her innocence by walking through fire. The logic was simple and cruel. If she were pure, the gods would protect her from burns. If she emerged scarred or dead, it was proof of guilt. Centuries later, the same logic would reappear in medieval Europe, where accused witches were submerged in rivers or forced to grasp red-hot iron, their survival considered divine verdict. What unites these distant worlds is systematic dehumanization elevated to law. Priests recorded each ordeal as evidence, witnesses as data. The screams of the accused became legal documents, the burns inked as proof of divine will. A 14th-century manuscript from Bengal lists these trials by number. 8 women tested, 3 survived. The tone is cold, administrative, there's no emotion, only record-keeping. Spectators treated it as spectacle. Merchants sold food near the fire pits, children played while judgment was rendered. Chroniclers note that in some kingdoms, the ritual became festival. The boundary between punishment and entertainment dissolved. The empire had turned cruelty into ritual, and ritual into theater. Even survival brought no redemption. Women who passed the ordeal were rarely restored to honor. Many were forced into exile, bearing the physical proof of purity as lifelong scars. To modernize, it is monstrous. But to those within the system, it was order. The fire wasn't punishment, it was purification, a cosmic test of moral worth. That was the genius of institutionalized horror. It required no tyrant, only belief. Pause and imagine standing in that crowd, heat washing over you, the accused stepping barefoot into the flames. Everyone around you whispers prayers, convinced they are witnessing divine truth. To speak against it would be heresy, to feel pity would be weakness. And so, silence reigns. In these rituals, the harvest of hearts, the promise of Moloch, the ghost marriages, the living oracles, the trial of purity, runs a single thread, the perfection of systematic control. The human body became an altar, the human mind a battlefield. Empires learned that obedience could be manufactured not just through swords or taxes, but through belief refined into bureaucracy. Clay tablets, temple ledgers, stone carvings, each record echoes the same chilling precision: dates, offerings, names erased. The machinery of faith turned with mathematical grace. The victims did not die for chaos, they died for order, and the chroniclers who wrote of these acts did not weep, they marveled, they called them beautiful. What makes these rituals too disturbing for movies isn't the blood or the fire, it's the calmness, the way whole societies functioned smoothly while horror hid beneath ceremony. It's the realization that civilization's brightest eras often built their foundations on orchestrated pain. So when we speak of progress, of art, of enlightenment, we must remember the ledgers that counted hearts, children, brides, prophets, and innocents alike, not as people, but as offerings. Because history's darkness doesn't scream, it whispers in languages long dead that every empire must decide what it worships more, its gods or its humanity. If this haunted glimpse into our past stirs something in you, subscribe and tell me, which of these rituals stays with you when the lights go out? Because next, we'll pull back even farther to see how these horrors became the machinery of empire itself. When you step back from the blood-stained altars, a terrifying pattern emerges. None of these atrocities were accidents of faith. They were machines, vast, self-perpetuating systems that fed on belief and bureaucracy alike. The horror wasn't just what they did, it was how rationally, how efficiently, how calmly they did it. In empire after empire, ritual cruelty evolved from superstition into structure. In the Aztec dominion, priests kept ledgers that matched the precision of accountants. Each sacrifice correlated to harvest cycles, each execution cross-referenced with astrological signs. The human body became a statistic, a variable in divine arithmetic. Chroniclers described the great ceremonies as account balancing with the sun. To maintain order, the empire needed numbers, not names. The same logic haunted Carthage. Those who offered their firstborn were exempt from certain levies, a reward written into civic code. The more you gave, the higher your social standing. Archaeologists unearthed fragments of legal tablets showing temple donations listed beside property deeds, as if burning a child and buying a home were parallel acts of civic virtue. It wasn't chaos, it was policy. And in China, the ghost marriages that sealed brides inside tombs were orchestrated by local bureaucrats who issued certificates of spiritual union. Official stamps authenticated each ritual as lawful property transfer. The government taxed even the dead, ensuring the empire profited from every burial. A woman's death wasn't a loss, it was a transaction. This is what made these rituals unbreakable. They weren't maintained by sadists but by clerks, priests, and citizens convinced they were protecting civilization itself. The cruelty was systemic. It wore the face of normalcy. Consider Mesopotamia's living oracles. Their trances dictated policy. Kings went to war, built temples, and sentenced thousands based on the mumblings of starved seers. When famine struck, the oracles were blamed for false prophecy. Punishment came as purification, starvation renewed. It was a cycle designed to feed itself. Suffering created prophecy. Prophecy justified power. Power demanded more suffering. The efficiency of empire is never accidental. Even Rome, whose legions conquered continents, borrowed ritualized terror from older faiths. Captives paraded, whipped, crucified, their pain choreographed for spectacle. When the empire baptized cruelty in ceremony, it learned something timeless. Fear is the most stable currency. Historians often write of these acts with detached wonder. They marvel at how order was maintained, how belief unified vast populations. Yet behind that order lurked a truth too dark to celebrate: bureaucratized dehumanization. What began as worship became management. What began as offering became economy. The numbers tell their own story. In some Aztec years, 50,000 sacrifices were recorded, each body processed, each death serving a calculated purpose. In Carthage, archaeologists estimate over 20,000 infant urns buried across centuries, labeled as fulfilled vows. In ancient China, Tomb inscriptions list dozens of attendants, gifted to noblemen per decade. This wasn't chaos. It was civilization running smoothly. Pause and imagine the silence between those acts. The cities thriving, markets bustling, children playing in courtyards shadowed by altars. For most citizens, the horror was invisible, normalized by repetition, sanctified by rhetoric. That's the ultimate victory of the system, when fear becomes faith, resistance becomes sin. And so the empires endured, feeding upon the obedience of the very people they terrified. Each ritual refined not just the method of killing, but the art of forgetting. Because the true horror wasn't the blade or the flame, it was how entire generations learned to look away and call it sacred. But the deeper you stare into these patterns, the more you see the machinery turning still. The question is no longer why they did it, but how the human mind could accept it as divine. What makes these rituals truly monstrous isn't their brutality, it's their perfection. Every empire that embraced them discovered the same terrible truth: when suffering is given purpose, it becomes unstoppable. Across time, these systems learned to self-replicate. Victims became participants, executioners became priests, and horror became heritage. A young boy watching his father offer captives atop a pyramid grew to believe it was necessary. A mother who lost her child to Moloch found solace by volunteering at the next ceremony, convinced her grief had meaning. It was psychological warfare on a generational scale, pain converted into faith. Records from Carthage mention second sacrifices, in which surviving siblings were later presented to complete the family's vow. In Mesopotamia, temple apprentices, once servants to the oracles, inherited their chambers, sealing themselves into the same cycle of starvation and ecstasy. The system needed no reform. It replaced its victims with the willing. The empire's greatest triumph wasn't in conquest, but in convincing the conquered that obedience was piety. In China, peasants began arranging ghost marriages voluntarily, fearing that an unmarried dead son would curse the family. In medieval courts, women begged to undergo fire ordeals to prove their innocence. Terror had rewritten love. Even entertainment became indoctrination. During Aztec festivals, clay figurines of captives were sold as toys for children. In the Middle Ages, sketches of trial fires adorned cathedral margins, saints triumphant, flames rendered almost beautiful. Generations were raised on imagery that made horror divine. Beneath that surface ran the logic of economics. Priests, scribes, and nobles profited from offerings. Temples collected land, livestock, and gold as penance. The blood of victims bought bread for the faithful. When devotion becomes economy, cruelty becomes infrastructure. And once infrastructure is built, it endures long after the gods are gone. Consider this: the Roman Empire's public executions evolved directly into medieval fairs, then into modern spectacles. Crowds still gathering, cameras replacing torches. The ritual never ended, it only changed its costume. The ancient impulse to turn another's suffering into moral theater remains embedded in culture. One surviving Babylonian inscription reads, "The god rejoices in order, the people rejoice in fear." That single line captures the entire system. Fear is stability, pain is proof. The body becomes message, and the ledgers of suffering remain neat, balanced, eternal. Pause and consider. Entire villages once surrendered at the mere whisper of what awaited their daughters. In some regions, families scarred children intentionally, branding them as unworthy to deter slavers or priests. Love itself weaponized into defense. That's what the archives never say aloud, that devotion and horror often shared the same heartbeat. As centuries passed, these rituals faded, outlawed, erased from polite chronicles. Yet their residue endures in myths of purity, in traditions of sacrifice, in the quiet shame carried through bloodlines. Civilizations rose and fell, but the pattern remained: obedience sanctified, empathy punished, memory buried. And now, standing centuries later, we can trace the line, the systemic transformation of cruelty into culture. The gods may have vanished, but the machinery they built still hums beneath us, disguised as faith, as justice, as order. If these revelations feel unbearable, that's the point. Because history's greatest horrors were never about monsters. They were about systems built by ordinary hands, polished until they gleamed with the illusion of righteousness. And as you breathe in the smoke of forgotten altars, ask yourself, if every age finds its own ritual, what sacrifices does ours demand? The incense fades, the chants are gone. What remains is the echo, the soft, unending rhythm of civilizations that perfected cruelty and called it worship. The blade, the fire, the offering, all dust now. Yet their logic, their architecture of fear, still shapes the world around us. Because when you strip away the divine names, the symbols, the idols, you find the same equation repeating through time: power requires ritual. The ancient empires understood that to control the body, you must first claim the soul. That is why their ceremonies were not crimes, but celebrations. They made obedience beautiful. They made terror sacred. Look closer, and you'll see how modern systems inherit their blueprints. The public spectacle of punishment becomes news, sacrifice becomes policy, and faith becomes branding. We no longer burn offerings on altars, but we burn hours, youth, and conscience in quieter fires. Economic, political, digital. The gods have changed, but their appetite hasn't. Archaeologists call the remnants of those old temples sites of devotion. Yet every cracked idol, every charred stone, whispers something different. People once believed this was necessary. And perhaps, in another 1,000 years, our monuments will whisper the same about us. Because what truly horrifies isn't the gore or the ritual. It's how easily entire societies agreed to it. How they wrote hymns to their own subjugation. How they kept records so meticulous, so calm, as if precision could excuse what they were doing. The true machinery of horror isn't forged in cruelty, it's built in justification. And that's where history becomes a mirror. The empires that once raised pyramids of sacrifice didn't fall because they ran out of blood. They fell because belief devoured itself. The same devotion that bound their people also blinded them. They mistook control for order, fear for faith, ritual for meaning. So when we peer into the past, we're not looking at monsters. We're looking at ourselves, refined, efficient, and convinced of our own righteousness. The same impulse that made priests carve idols from stone now drives us to carve algorithms from code, both promising salvation, both demanding submission. The 5 forgotten rituals were not anomalies. They were warnings. Messages carved in bone, left behind by those who believed too completely. They show us what happens when faith loses empathy, when systems turn suffering into routine, when humanity kneels before its own reflection and calls it God. The lamps go out. The smoke disperses. You're alone again, but the silence hums with understanding. History didn't bury these rituals to hide them from us. It buried them to test if we'd repeat them.